Well, for more on the popularity of podcasts, let's bring in Gavin Ballas. He's the Executive Vice President of Client Strategy for Oxford Road in Los Angeles. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Now, this is fascinating because just in the US, research firm IAB forecasts that podcast revenue will surge to $659 million by 2020. Now, this isn't a new platform, so why is it seeing such strong growth?
Well, the growth in listenership drives revenue for sure. And I think 5 years ago, it was 47 million people a month in the US were listening to podcasts. This year, they're predicting about 90 million, so doubling of growth just in the listenership. And then on top of that, our advertisers are seeing tremendous results, so they're continuing to pour money into it. Other advertisers are seeing it. And so it's a doubling of listenership, but it's going to more than double in the ad revenue, and that's probably going to continue for a bit.
Now, podcasting is obviously big business in the US. What's it doing internationally?
Well, primarily podcast to this point has been an English language phenomenon. So the markets that we see that tend to have a kind of a thriving podcast market right now are going to be Canada, UK, Australia. There hasn't been a huge market for kind of non-English podcasts, but I think that's going to change. I suspect that's one of the areas that we're going to see continued growth in.
And so how do these podcasts, obviously there's thousands, if not millions of them out there, how do these distinguish themselves from one another?
Yeah, I think there's about 700,000 total, 28 billion episodes, something like that. There's a lot. Not anybody can, anybody can put up a podcast, but not everybody can have an audience, right? So, you know, some of the same kind of rules of entertainment on radio, of being personable, giving great content, that's important. Having great network partners that can actually help you get that audience, having an audience from maybe a different content, from a different channel, that's going to help you drive listenership, which is going to obviously have an impact on revenue and the ability to drive revenue from your podcast.
And are there certain genres of podcasts that tend to do better than others? And how are they growing their audiences?
So in terms of, from our perspective, in terms of the kinds of advertisers we work with, there are definitely specific kinds of programming that work better for our advertisers. They're not necessarily the biggest genres. So what we see, certainly the kind of produced, kind of news-oriented programs continue to be very, very strong. But they're not always necessarily the best performers for our advertisers. But you also see a lot growing in more personality type of programs, really personality focused, like a Joe Rogan, you know, and comedians and those sorts of people do very, very well because they're able to drive a very strong connection with their audience.
Now, in terms of making a living at this, we know that getting the equipment and the access is easy, but as you mentioned, getting the audience is a different story. How much is the average podcaster making versus some of these top paid hosts?
Yeah, it turns out being on radio or TV isn't as easy as just turning on the camera, right? Some of these hosts can certainly make a very good living, and once they are established, can actually, you know, make a fantastic living. We see shows that that our advertisers are on that where one read can cost, you know, $50,000 to $75,000 just for one episode. So you can imagine that some of these hosts are making a very, very good living in this space.
Now let's look at some of the platforms. We saw that podcasting company Luminary was essentially being called the Netflix of podcasts with its subscription service and boasting this celebrity podcasters. And then it seemed to take a turn. So what's behind all the uproar?
Well, I think they've got some work to do in establishing some better relationships with some of the content producers. I think there's a lot of interest in this idea that, well, Netflix showed that people will pay for content on a monthly basis, so why wouldn't that apply to podcast? The challenge right now is that most of the shows that people listen to are free. They're going to be free, and getting them over to an $8 a month subscription, I think, is a challenge. I think they may be a little bit early, but they've done some things that I think they're correcting around kind of protecting or hoarding kind of the listener data from the hosts that are on their platform that I think they're adjusting. That's created some controversy. But I think in the long run, this model probably has legs, but they may be a little bit early before people are willing to pay. But I think it's definitely feeling like a bit of a gold rush of people wanting to get in, because they're not the only ones looking to try to get a subscription model going in podcast.
All right, Gavin Ballas, Executive Vice President of Client Strategy for Oxford Road. Thanks so much.